Well, Jay, I think, has a right to be angry because the way he sees it is that I have hidden and covered up certain obvious things that should have been mentioned in my initial presentation. But I think he's mistaken in that I did not deliberately overlook anything. The initial presentation was used up in pulling together all of the verses of the Quran that relate to our subject as much as that would be possible within the time frame that I was given, but also to lay out the interpretive framework that will help us to understand any verse of the Quran. I've stressed the intertextual and the contextual readings that the Quran must be subjected to. So I wasn't hiding anything. At the same time, Jay thinks that I should have referred to the seerah of Ibn Ishaq in the recension of Ibn Hisham, which he says, whom he says died 200 years after the Prophet Muhammad. So he thinks that we ought to rely on writings which were written close to 200 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad in order to understand Muhammad best. But what I've done instead is I've followed the scholarly discourse which says that the Quran is the most authentic document we have concerning the life and teachings of the Prophet Muhammad. And the seerah and magazi works which were written a couple of years, 100 years after him are not so reliable. So if we want to understand who Muhammad is, we do not interpret the Quran in the light of the seerah, but we interpret the seerah and the magazi works in the light of the Quran. And particularly we can note, for example, this is not my own spin and rereading of it in the 20th century. We have a writing here from Lloyd Ridgeon in a book entitled War and Peace in the World's Religions. Writing on Islam, Ridgeon tells us, therefore the Maghazi literature provided the Muslims with a myth of unity and expansion reflecting the aims of the new dynasty, the Abbasids. This had to do with the political milieu in which they lived, precisely the things that I've emphasized in my previous presentation. So I wasn't hiding anything. Moreover, I'm not defending Muslims here tonight. I admit that Muslims have done some horrible things, and people of other faiths too have done some horrible things in history. But I was speaking about the teachings of the Quran in particular. Is the Quran a book about peace? And I think that I've established that very clearly with the evidence that I've called within the interpretive framework that I've given. Jay did not follow that interpretive framework. In fact, Jay, I think you have contradicted yourself here tonight based on what you have presented elsewhere. Because elsewhere, and in other talks, Jay argues that the seerah and magazi and hadith literature are not dependable because they're written so late. And tonight, he wants us to believe that they are dependable because they paint Muhammad as a violent individual. But I'm putting before you that the Quran, the earliest document about the Prophet Muhammad, shows him to not be a violent individual. What about the Jews of Banu Qurayza? He says that 800 of them were slaughtered. Where does he get that? From the Maghazi literature. There's nothing about that in the Quran. The most the Quran says in Surah 33 is that the Prophet Muhammad had an engagement with the other people. He slew some and he took some as captive. The numbers are not given. The numbers which are given in the Maghazi literature are grossly exaggerated. If you think of 800 people having their throats slit in one evening, and then where are they buried? We already spoke about the Battle of the Trenches. If this occurred exactly after the Battle of the Trenches, the obvious place to bury them would be in the trenches. But the reports say that they were buried in the marketplace of Medina. Now imagine, after going through all of the trouble of digging the trenches, now you go dig the graves of these slain individuals somewhere else. My explanation for this is that when these materials were written, they didn't have it all together, and people invented things. If Muslims wanted to pursue a violent approach to non-Muslims, they wanted the Prophet Muhammad as their model, and if they could not find him as a model violent individual, they had to mythologize him, invent the violence that they needed for their own justification.